Beatrix Strand had never imagined a secretary could silence an entire boardroom simply by standing up. 14 people sat frozen as she slammed a folder onto the table and shouted into the face of the 28-year-old woman that if she couldn't handle it, she could get out. Sloane Merrick didn't argue. She didn't remind her that the company's 3 largest clients refused to work with anyone else, or that 9 years earlier she had sat in 2 rented rooms writing the first contracts this company ever signed, back when it couldn't afford a single truck of its own. She simply lifted the badge from around her neck, set it down on the table, said one word, "Yes," and turned toward the door. Beatrix smiled, certain the silence meant she had won, but at the back of the room, a man who had been standing there through the entire meeting began to walk forward. He didn't raise his voice. He picked up the badge, wiped it once with his thumb, and slipped it into his breast pocket, unhurried, like a man retrieving something that had always belonged to him. Beatrix demanded to know who he was to walk into her boardroom. He answered in a low, slow voice that he was the man who paid her salary. Then he turned to the 14 people seated at that table and said a single sentence, one that sent 4 of them pushing back their chairs and rising to their feet, and left 2 board members pale before he had even finished speaking. In 5 months at the head of that company, Beatrix Strand had never once asked who truly owned it, and she had even less idea whose woman she had just thrown out. If you've ever watched a good person be looked down on, leave a like for this story. Share it with someone you believe deserves to be seen for who they really are, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of what happens next. The sentence had only 3 clauses, and Massimo Orsini spoke it so slowly that each word had enough time to fall upon the table before the next one was released. He said that the doors of this company would remain open until 6 o'clock that evening. He said that anyone who wanted to go with her should stand up and leave now. Then he said that after today, he wouldn't take anyone else. He didn't offer another word of explanation, and he didn't look at Beatrix a second time, and it was that refusal even to look at her that sent a chill down her spine. When the sound of chairs had ceased, when the door had closed behind him, Beatrix Strand understood that she had to say something, anything, to reclaim the conference room that was slipping out of her grasp. She straightened, pulled the file toward her, and said in the same voice she always used during quarterly reports that this was a disciplined organization, that every personnel decision followed established procedure, and that she expected everyone who remained seated to understand that. Her words fell into an emptiness where no one was willing to catch them. Not a single nod, not one murmur of agreement. The person seated closest to her was the chief financial officer, and he was staring intently at one corner of the page before him, as though something written there were more worthy of his attention than everything that had just happened in that room. Beatrix waited 3 seconds. She waited exactly 3 seconds, then turned to her left, toward Preston Galloway, who for the past 5 months had always been the first to echo her words, the man who always knew precisely what to say to soften an uncomfortable silence. She said nothing. She merely looked at him, and that look meant, "Say something." Preston didn't raise his head. He picked up his pen, turned it halfway around, set it down, then bent even lower over his documents, and he held that position until Beatrix was forced to withdraw her gaze. In those 9 seconds, she learned something she should have learned long ago, that the people quickest to stand on her side were also the quickest to recognize when it was time to stop. Near the far end of the table, a woman with silver hair stood holding her coat over one arm, but she didn't leave immediately. She remained there with one hand resting on the back of her chair, and she told Beatrix that she had worked at this harbor for 34 years. She said she had served under 4 general managers, had counted cargo on nights when the temperature fell below freezing, and had seen every kind of person imaginable pass through the corridor outside. Then she delivered her final sentence, saying that in all those 34 years, she had never seen anyone work the way Miss Merrick did, and she didn't say it loudly or harshly, but in the simple tone people use when stating an obvious truth they assume everyone already knows. Ruth Ann Bowers didn't wait for an answer. She put on her coat and walked out, and this time the sound of the door closing was even softer than before. Beatrix looked around the table and counted the empty chairs, then stopped at one place she hadn't expected. Constance Brannigan was still seated exactly where she had been, her hands folded over the meeting minutes, her back straight, showing no intention of going anywhere. Beatrix felt something almost like relief, and she asked her chief legal officer whether she wished to say anything. Constance replied that she had nothing to say at the moment. Beatrix asked again, her voice less certain now, what she thought about what had just happened. Constance looked at her a little longer than necessary, then answered that she thought the meeting was over. No one in the room understood why the woman had stayed, and she had no intention of helping them understand. Then, one by one, everyone gathered their papers and left, and the long table with its 12 seats slowly emptied until Beatrix Strand was standing there alone. In front of her, in the place where Sloane Merrick had sat for the past 5 months, lay a thick file, neatly fastened, its spine facing outward, and the edges of its pages perfectly aligned. It remained there for 3 full hours. The cleaner passed through and didn't touch it. Beatrix's assistant came in to retrieve the projector, saw the file, then walked out empty-handed. By late afternoon, when the light in the room had changed color, the file was still lying exactly where it had been left, and not one person in that entire building dared to be the first to lay a hand on it. The car had been waiting in the basement since before the meeting began, and Wallace Drum didn't ask a single question when the two of them got in. He simply shifted into gear and let the car crawl up the ramp. Sloane sat in the back seat, staring straight through the window, and she allowed the silence to stretch across exactly 4 intersections before she spoke. She said he had no right to do that. Massimo replied that he hadn't done anything. She turned toward him, and her voice was trembling, not because she was about to cry, but because she was trying not to raise it. She said he had stepped forward in front of 14 people. He had spoken those words, and now everyone in that entire building would believe that the only reason she had been able to stand up was because someone had been standing behind her. He listened to everything without interrupting, then said he hadn't rescued her. He had only picked up the badge. She told him that it hadn't been merely a matter of picking up a badge, and he knew that perfectly well. He didn't argue with her. She went on, more slowly now, saying that he had made her a promise. She reminded him of the day the investment fund brought Beatrix Strand in, of the evening she had sat across from him and made him promise that no matter what happened inside that company, he wouldn't interfere with her work, and he had promised. He said he remembered. She asked him what today had been then. He was silent for a moment before saying that he had kept his word for 5 months, that he had remained still through every message she sent him at 2 o'clock in the morning, through every time she told him she was fine, through the day that woman called her the secretary in front of the entire room, and she came home still insisting she was fine. He asked whether 5 months of that had been enough. Sloane couldn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, then said he still didn't understand why she had done it. He told her that he understood, and that he had never agreed with it. She said that at this harbor, Merrick wasn't an ordinary name. She said there was a document from 9 years ago with her father's name written on the line marked cause, and that document was still in the city records, where anyone who wanted to dig it up could do so. She said that if her name appeared on a contract, all it would take was one disgruntled partner or one lawyer, with too much time on his hands, for someone to drag that family name into the middle of a negotiation and turn it into something to bargain with. She said she had chosen to keep her name off the documents, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want the company to pay the price for something her father had never done. When she finished, Massimo said it was the highest price he had ever seen anyone willingly pay for someone else. She asked what about him. What had he paid to put a woman chief executive over his head? He replied that the harbor automation project had required capital, and the fund providing that capital had made it a condition that the company have an executive board independent of its owner. So he had agreed because, at the time, he needed their money more than he needed that chair. She said that meant both of them had sold one thing in exchange for another. He said the difference was that he had sold a chair, while she had sold her name. The car traveled a long way after that, crossing the bridge, and Wallace still said nothing. He merely kept his eyes on the road ahead, as though the back seat were empty. Then Sloane asked Massimo the question she had been holding in her mind ever since she walked out of the conference room. She asked how long he had been standing at the back of that room. Massimo didn't turn toward her. He looked out the window and answered that he had been there from the beginning. Sloane sat motionless. In her mind, she went back through everything that had been said in that room, from the very first minute, every word, even the words that woman had used to address her, even the part where she had stood there listening without speaking a single word in her own defense, and she understood that he had heard all of it. He hadn't missed a single word. 20 minutes after the conference room door closed for the last time, the desk phone in Beatrix Strand's office rang, and the man on the other end was the chief operating officer of Kestrel Foods Group. He didn't spend long on pleasantries. He said there was a routing detail for the refrigerated shipment arriving at the harbor that afternoon that had to be finalized within the hour, and he wanted to speak directly with Miss Merrick. In the most pleasant voice she could summon, Beatrix replied that Miss Merrick was no longer employed by the company, and that she would personally make certain everything proceeded smoothly. Then, she waited. There was no sound of papers on the other end, no tapping on a keyboard, no sound at all. The silence stretched on so long that Beatrix had to ask whether he was still there. He said he was. Then he asked again, more slowly this time, whether she had just said that Miss Merrick was no longer there. Beatrix confirmed that she had. He asked when it had happened. She said that morning. Another silence followed, shorter than the first but far more uncomfortable. And then he said exactly 2 words. Put it on hold. Beatrix asked what he wanted put on hold. He replied that he wanted that afternoon's shipment put on hold, along with the entire live operations schedule, and that someone from his company would contact her after its senior leadership had finished meeting. She tried to explain that the team remained intact, that the procedures remained intact, and that nothing had changed regarding the $460 million contract. He replied that his company had agreed to the schedule in the first place, because one person had put her own name behind it. And now that person was no longer there, so everything was back at the starting line. Then he hung up. Beatrix lowered the receiver and sat motionless for a while, telling herself that this was a normal reaction from a major client upon learning of an abrupt personnel change, that one telephone call at a higher level would be enough to put everything back where it belonged. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, it was a pharmaceutical distributor in Philadelphia, the company's 3rd largest client, and the woman calling didn't even ask about the shipments. She asked directly whether Miss Merrick had left, though she didn't say where she had heard the news. Beatrix gave her the same answer she had given before. The woman on the other end said her company would postpone signing the contract renewal that was already on the table, and she wanted a meeting with the person who held the highest authority before the end of the week. Beatrix said that she was the person with the highest authority. There was a brief pause on the other end before the woman said that, in that case, she wanted to meet with the person above her. The call ended there. Beatrix summoned Preston Galloway to her office. He entered with the bearing of a man who had prepared his answer while still standing in the hallway, and he said that this was entirely predictable, that clients always overreacted during the first 24 hours, that he had seen it happen at 3 different companies, and that every time, it had settled down within a week. Beatrix asked whether he was certain. Preston said anyone could be replaced, that no single person in any organization was greater than the organization itself, and that he would personally take over every client relationship that very afternoon. She looked at him and remembered the way he had bent over his documents that morning, but she said nothing. After he left the office, Beatrix remained there alone. She pulled her desk calendar toward her, the calendar she had used for the past 5 months, only to mark her briefings with the board. She found the square circled in red, the day the cold chain system was scheduled to go live with Kestrel's entire flow of cargo moving through it. Then she placed one finger on the square for today and began counting backward, 1 square at a time, and she counted 3 times, because every count gave her the same number, 10 days. The next morning, Preston Galloway called a meeting at 7 o'clock and presented what he called a resource reallocation plan. On paper, it was remarkably tidy. He divided one person's work among 3 people, assigning client relations to a sales director, harbor operations to a shift manager, and contracts to a legal staff member who had joined the company only 4 months earlier. He told the room that this was an opportunity to standardize a process that had been personalized for far too long. By noon that day, the first crack appeared. The man from legal called to ask about Appendix B of the Kestrel contract, the appendix that established the permissible temperature range during transfer, and he wanted to know why the threshold had been set exactly 1.5 degrees tighter than the industry standard. Preston told him to follow the industry standard to keep things simple. The man asked whether the client had to be notified if they relaxed a stricter threshold that the client had already agreed to. Preston told him to make a note of it and deal with it later. No one in that room knew that the 1.5 degrees wasn't an arbitrary figure, that it was the result of 3 nights Sloane Merrick had spent inside the cold storage facility with a handheld thermometer, measuring the actual delay in the refrigeration system in Transfer Bay Number 4, and that if the threshold were relaxed, then under heavy load conditions, the cargo in the outermost row would exceed the limit before the sensors had time to sound an alarm. That afternoon, it was the operations division's turn. A familiar carrier called to request that a delivery be rerouted through the south entrance because construction was blocking the road, and the shift manager approved the change in 3 minutes because, on paper, it fell entirely within his authority. That evening, the receiving company called to demand an explanation for why no one had warned them in advance, and the shift manager replied that there was no provision in the procedure requiring prior notice. The person on the other end said that for 9 years, whenever a route changed, Miss Merrick had always called them at least 4 hours beforehand, that they had arranged their unloading crews around that practice for 9 years, and that now they had 7 people standing at the wrong entrance. The shift manager went back through the entire procedure, looking for that provision, and couldn't find it, because it had never been written down, because it wasn't a provision, it was a promise. By the 3rd day, everything had begun to crack in every direction at once. No one could explain why a contractor in the Eastern District was paid on a 15-day cycle, while every other contractor was paid every 30 days, until the owner of that company called and said that 5 years earlier he had nearly gone bankrupt, and someone at this company had personally vouched for him so his payment cycle could be shortened, and he hadn't made a single late delivery since. No one could explain why 3 names on the client list were marked with a handwritten letter in the corner, and no one dared to guess, because one wrong guess could cost them a client. By the afternoon of the 4th day, Preston Galloway ordered every filing cabinet Sloan had left behind to be opened, and he did it hoping to find an empty space, a gap, some sign that the woman had deliberately kept something to herself so that no one could replace her. He found nothing. Everything was there, clean, numbered, arranged by year, with a table of contents on the first page, and notes written in small, even handwriting along the margins. Every reason behind every exception had been recorded. Every person who needed to be called was listed with a telephone number and the best time to call. There was even a page identifying the clients who didn't like receiving emails on weekends. And that was what brought the room to silence. If she had hidden something, it would have been easy, because then the fault would have been hers. But she hadn't hidden anything. She had written everything down and kept it neatly arranged there for 9 years, and that filing cabinet was proving something no one in that building wanted to say aloud, that the problem had never been that her work was complicated, but that no one had ever been willing to open it and read. On Thursday morning, Constance Brannigan knocked on the door of Beatrix Strand's office, walked in, placed a bound packet of documents in the middle of the desk, then turned, walked out, and closed the door behind her without saying a word. Beatrix sat looking at it for a while, and she had intended to leave it there until the afternoon, but something about the way the woman had set it down made her change her mind. The first page contained only a single heading: Operational Intervention Statistics, most recent 18 months, with columns of figures beneath it. 9 clients had formally submitted written notices of their intention to terminate their contracts during those 18 months, and all 9 names were still on the company's active client list. Beside each name was the date the notice had been submitted, the date it had been withdrawn, and the interval between those 2 dates. In some cases, it was 4 days, in others 11, and not one had taken longer than 3 weeks. The next page listed 4 projects that had been flagged as being at risk of suspension, along with the date each one was restored and the remaining value of its contract at that time. The third page held a single figure in the center: $21 million. The annual operating losses avoided through the temperature variance control procedure implemented 3 years earlier, and beneath it was a detailed calculation for every quarter. Beatrix knew that figure. She had read it in the report she herself had presented to the board during her 2nd month in office. She had used it to prove that the company's operational foundation was sound, and she remembered very clearly that Preston Galloway's name had appeared in the lower corner of that report. She turned the page. Beginning with page 4 was the section Constance had prepared with the greatest care, a 2-column comparison, with the name of the person who had signed the approval in the official records on the left, and the name of the person who had actually performed the work according to the system logs and meeting minutes on the right. On the left were Preston Galloway, 2 executive vice presidents, a former regional director, and Beatrix herself. On the right, line after line, all the way down the page and continuing on to the next, was the same name. Beatrix began turning the pages faster, and she kept turning until she reached the last one. There were no tables or figures on that final page, only a copy of a document whose edges had yellowed with age, the company's original registration filing, signed 9 years earlier, and in the section bearing the signature of the person who had filed it was a handwritten name she had to look at twice before she could read it: Merrick. Beatrix sat for a very long time with that page before her. She thought perhaps it was a relative, someone who happened to share the same last name, because the name wasn't uncommon in this harbor district. She thought perhaps it was merely an administrative employee hired to submit the paperwork, because 9 years ago, this company had been nothing at all. She tried to fit the two ends together. A 28-year-old secretary who had sat at the head of the table for the past 5 months, and a name written on the document that had given birth to this entire company, and she couldn't make them meet, because nowhere in her mind was there an arrangement that allowed those two things to belong to the same person. She called her assistant into the office and asked what position Miss Merrick had held before Beatrix arrived. The assistant replied that according to the personnel records, she had joined the company in its first year, and her title had remained unchanged throughout all 9 years. Beatrix asked whether it had truly never changed. The assistant said that 3 promotion proposals were preserved in the file, and all 3 carried a note stating that the person nominated had declined. Beatrix told the assistant to leave. She sat alone in her office, and for the first time in 5 months, she asked herself a question she should have asked during her very first week. 3 floors below, in her own office, Constance Brannigan closed the call log and placed it inside a drawer, the log showing that at 10:40 on Monday night, the evening before the meeting, she had placed a call that lasted 6 minutes, and in the recipient column there were only 2 initials. Massimo Orsini asked her to meet him in the upstairs office of the Western Warehouse, where he still worked whenever he didn't want anyone to see him entering through the main doors. And from his very first sentence, he spoke plainly, without circling around the point, saying that he wanted her to come and run the entire harbor division of Orsini Harbor Group. He laid out each term one by one. She would have final authority over operations, and wouldn't have to ask anyone for permission. She would choose every member of her own team. The budget would bear her signature, not merely her recommendation, and her title would reflect the work she actually did, not what other people wanted to see. Sloane listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she remained silent for quite a while. Then she asked him a question for which he had no answer prepared. She asked who she would be, in the eyes of the people still inside that other building, if she accepted. Massimo asked whom she meant. She said she meant the 4 people who had risen from their chairs that day, the ones now sitting at home wondering what they had just done. She said she meant the people who had remained seated, the ones who hadn't dared to stand because they had mortgages and children in college, the ones who had watched her being called the secretary for 5 months and had never opened their mouths. She said she meant that woman herself as well. She said that if her name appeared the next morning on an announcement naming her executive vice president of their largest competitor, not one of those people would believe she had earned it through 9 years of work. They would believe only one thing, that she had it because she belonged to him. She said that belief would follow her into every meeting, every time she opened her mouth, every time she signed her name to anything, and she would have to live with it until the day she retired. Massimo didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was thinking too much, didn't tell her people would eventually forget, and didn't tell her that her ability would speak for itself. Although he believed all 3 things, he simply rose, walked to the window, stood there for a moment, then turned back, and said he wasn't going to try to persuade her that day. She asked what he intended to do. He said he wanted her to go home and open the second drawer of the desk in the front room. Sloane frowned, and he continued, saying there was a yellow envelope inside, a large string tie envelope, and that it had been there for 7 years. She said she knew the envelope. She said it contained the procedural documents he had given her to sign that year. He asked whether she had read all of them. She fell silent. He didn't ask a second time. He only told her to go home and read every page, from the first to the last, then call him whenever she wanted to continue the conversation. She asked what was inside. He said there was something in it that belonged to her. Sloane arrived home shortly before 7 o'clock that evening. She opened the second drawer, and the envelope lay exactly where it had always been, beneath a stack of old bills, its string still wound securely around the fastener, its edges softened slightly by time. She picked it up, placed it on the kitchen table, then went to make dinner. She ate alone with the envelope lying less than a foot away. She washed the dishes, and when she returned, it was still there. She sat down, rested one hand on it, turned it over so the front faced upward, and looked at her name written in his handwriting in the upper corner, written in ink, slightly slanted, the same handwriting she had seen across thousands of pages over 9 years. She sat that way for a very long time. She didn't open it. She thought that if she did, something would change, and could never be changed back, and tonight she didn't want anything else in her life to change. Near midnight, she returned it to the drawer, closed it, and went to bed. A little more than 6 miles away, Massimo Orsini looked at the dark screen of his phone, where no call had appeared, then turned it face down on the desk and switched off the light, because he had already waited 7 years, and he could wait a little longer. The leadership meeting on Monday morning of the following week lasted exactly 22 minutes, and Beatrix Strand opened by saying that she had considered every option and had decided to keep the live operation schedule unchanged. She said the board had been notified of that date 3 months earlier, that Kestrel had suspended the project but hadn't cancelled it, and that the only way to bring them back to the table was to prove that the company could still operate according to its commitments. Preston Galloway said it was the only right decision under the circumstances. She asked what he still needed. Preston replied that only one signature was missing from the box, certifying that the system was ready for commercial operation, and he said it in the tone people used when speaking of an administrative formality. Beatrix asked why it hadn't been obtained. Preston said that box fell under the authority of the person in charge of harbor operations, and the person in charge of harbor operations had resigned. She told him to find someone else. He said he would take care of it that day. The person Preston found was a 31-year-old shift manager who had been promoted only 5 months earlier, and he summoned the young man to his office shortly before noon. He told him this was an opportunity, that the company was going through a period of transition, and that senior leadership was watching the people willing to accept responsibility. The young man asked whether he could review the results of the previous load test. Preston said the test results were internal technical documents still under review, and that this signature merely certified that the system had completed every step required by the procedure, not that it had been technically approved. The young man asked who, then, was providing the technical approval. Preston said the contractor that supplied the module had already submitted its written certification. The young man sat in silence for quite a while. Then he asked who would be held responsible if anything happened. Preston said the company would be responsible, that no one ever signed a loan, and that the chief executive officer's signature would appear above his. The young man signed at 1:40 that afternoon, in the very box Sloane Merrick had pushed back across the table 9 days earlier when she said she wouldn't sign. By 4 o'clock, a copy of the signed submission was lying on Constance Brannigan's desk, because every document related to commercial operations had to pass through the legal department before being archived, and she had established that requirement 11 years earlier. She read it, then took from her drawer a copy of the second load test report Sloane had sent before leaving, placed the 2 documents side by side, and spent an hour writing. The memorandum she prepared was 2 pages long. The first page listed 3 points: that the commercial readiness certification had been signed by someone with no technical authority over the cold chain control system, that the results of the second load test 3.5'd to the signer at the time he signed, and that the former head of operations' written warning remained in effect and hadn't been refuted by any technical documentation. The second page contained only a short paragraph, stating clearly that the legal department wasn't blocking the executive team's decision, but required that the entire matter be entered into the official minutes and preserved as a record that couldn't be altered. She sent it at 5:10 to Beatrix, Preston, the secretary of the board, and the records department. Preston called her 7 minutes later and asked what she thought she was doing. Constance replied that she was doing her job. He said the memorandum would alarm the board for no reason. She said that if there truly was no reason, the board would read it and set it aside, and no one would have lost anything. He asked whose side she was on. Constance said she wasn't on anyone's side. She was on the side of the record. Then she hung up, printed a paper copy, signed her name in the corner, placed it inside a stiff folder, and locked it in the cabinet behind her, because she had been doing this work long enough to know that some papers would lie silent for months, then one day decide who remained seated inside that building, and who did not. Beatrix read the memorandum shortly before 7 o'clock that evening, read it twice, then opened her desk calendar and counted again. 8 days remained. Sloane Merrick called Kestrel's director of operations on Tuesday morning and asked for 15 minutes of his time. He agreed at once, but added that he needed to know in what capacity she was coming. She replied that she was coming as someone who used to work there. She took a bus to their headquarters on the north side of the city. She carried no briefcase, no computer, not a single sheet of paper. And when the receptionist asked which company she represented, she said she didn't represent anyone. 3 people were waiting in the small conference room on the 4th floor: the director of operations, someone from procurement, and an in-house lawyer whom the director had decided to bring in after giving it some thought. Sloane sat down and said at once that she hadn't come to win back the contract, that she didn't work for anyone, and that if, 15 minutes from now, they felt the meeting had been a mistake, she wouldn't contact them a second time. The lawyer asked whether she had brought any documents. She said she hadn't. He asked again whether she truly had nothing at all. She said she had walked out of that building with nothing but the coat she was wearing, that everything she had ever written remained untouched in their filing cabinets, and that today, all she had was her word. Then she told them what she had come to say. She said the cold chain control system for the project had a weakness at the transfer stage, when the load reached its upper threshold, that she had documented the issue in writing before she left, and that as far as she knew, it hadn't been resolved. The procurement representative asked what basis she had for saying that. She replied that she wouldn't provide a single figure, wouldn't discuss test results, wouldn't name any contractor, and wouldn't say who had done what inside that building, because all of those things belonged to her former company, not to her. She said the only thing she had the right to say was this, that if she were in their position, she wouldn't allow any cargo to enter the port on the scheduled date until an independent party had conducted a load test. The lawyer asked what would happen if the supplier refused. She said that under the contract, the buyer had the right to require independent testing before acceptance, that the right was set out in Appendix B, and that they had never exercised it in 9 years because they had never needed to. He wrote the words Appendix B in his notebook. The director of operations had remained silent until then. At last, he asked her a question in the plain-spoken voice of a man who had held that position for 20 years. He asked what she wanted in return. He said he had met many people who came bearing bad news about their former companies, and every time, after about 10 minutes, an offer would emerge, the name of another company, a business card, or a suggestion that his people ought to speak with someone else. He said he wouldn't blame her if she intended to do the same. He only wanted to know beforehand. Sloane didn't answer at once. She looked down at the tabletop for a moment, then raised her eyes and said that 11,000 tons of frozen cargo would enter that port during the first 3 weeks, that she had spent enough nights inside cold storage facilities to know what a ruined shipment looked like, and that she had signed Appendix B with her own hand. She said she wanted no one to lose their cargo. Then she said that was all she wanted, and she said it so calmly that no one in the room asked another question. The meeting ended after 19 minutes. At the door, the director of operations held out his hand, shook hers, and asked where she worked now. Sloane said she didn't work anywhere yet. He asked whether she wanted to leave her telephone number. She said her number had been in his contacts for 9 years, and if he needed it, he knew where to find it. Then she left, walked back to the bus stop, and carried nothing in her hands, just as she had when she arrived. News of that meeting reached Preston Galloway before nightfall, because Kestrel had immediately sent a formal notice requesting an independent load test before acceptance, and the notice cited Appendix B. He sat staring at the document for a very long time, and he understood that if the test went forward, everything he had spent 6 months concealing would be laid bare beneath the lights. The following morning, an internal complaint was sent to the legal department and the secretary of the board, alleging that Miss Sloane Merrick, a former employee, had removed confidential technical documents and provided them to a business partner with the intention of harming the company. 3 screenshots were attached to the complaint. The first showed part of a conversation from an internal group chat, cropped precisely where her name appeared alongside a few words about the test results, but with the question someone else had asked above it, and the full answer below it, both cut away. The second was a screenshot of the access log for the technical files, showing her account name and an access date 2 weeks before she resigned, when she was still employed by the company, and the work was still part of her responsibilities. The third was an image from a hallway camera inside the Kestrel building, showing her entering through the reception doors the previous morning, and it was the only one of the 3 that hadn't been cropped, because it didn't need to be. By afternoon, those 3 words had spread throughout the building. Someone said that explained why she had been so calm when she laid her badge on the table. Someone else said it turned out she had planned the whole thing in advance. The shift manager, who had signed the certification box a few days earlier, overheard the talk and returned to his desk, where he sat in silence for the rest of the afternoon. Sloane learned what had happened shortly before 6 o'clock that evening, when an old friend in the warehouse department sent her a single line saying that she should see what was being circulated inside the company. She read it, then sat motionless for 10 minutes. Massimo called her at 7 o'clock, and from his very first words she knew he had heard before she had. She also knew exactly where he was sitting, because his voice held a certain depth she heard, only after he had already decided what he was going to do. He said he would take care of it that night. She asked how he intended to do that. He said Galloway would withdraw the complaint himself before 9 o'clock the next morning, and he would personally write a correction and send it to every person who had received the complaint. Sloane asked whom he intended to call. He said she didn't need to know. She told him not to make the call. He fell silent. She continued, speaking slowly, one sentence at a time, saying that if he made that call, the complaint would disappear by 9 o'clock the next morning, and by noon, the entire building would know it had disappeared in a way that wasn't normal, and by evening not one of them would remember the complaint itself. They would remember only one thing, that Miss Merrick had someone powerful protecting her. She said that if her name was cleared that way, it wouldn't truly be cleared at all, because in their minds she would still be guilty, only guilty in a way no one dared touch. She said that for 9 years, she had kept his name out of her work, and she had paid for it by turning down 3 promotions and spending 5 months listening while people called her the secretary, and if she allowed him to step in now, all 9 of those years would have been for nothing. Then she said one final thing, that he had already made her a promise. There was no sound from the other end for so long that she had to look at the screen to make sure the call was still connected. Then Massimo asked what she intended to do if he did nothing. She said she would handle it herself. He asked what she needed. She said she didn't need anything. She only needed him to remain still and let the complaint follow the proper process. He asked once more whether she was certain. She said she was. Massimo Orsini said all right, then ended the call. In the 12 years he had occupied that position, no one had ever told him not to use the power he possessed, and no one had ever said such a thing and had him obey. He placed the phone face down on his desk and sat motionless in the darkness of that room for a very long time, without calling anyone. Once an internal complaint had been sent to both the legal department and the secretary of the board at the same time, it could no longer be left alone, and Constance Brannigan began working on it first thing the following morning, not because she believed or disbelieved what it alleged, but because internal policy required her to open an investigation file within 48 hours. She didn't call Sloane Merrick. She didn't send her a single line, didn't ask her a single question, and later, when someone asked why, she said the accused wasn't the source one used to verify a complaint. She did things her own way. She asked the systems department to give her permission to read the access logs and metadata for the entire project directory covering the previous 18 months, and she made it clear that she only needed to read them and had no need to open the contents of any file. She began with the second screenshot attached to the complaint, the image of the access log showing Sloane's account name, and the first thing she did was locate the original version of that very screen. She found it within 40 minutes, and the original was exactly 3 lines longer than the image in the complaint. Those 3 lines had been cut away, and they showed that the access in question had occurred during a work session created by a task assigned through the system itself. She entered that fact into the record in a single sentence, without comment. Then she continued with what she had intended to do from the beginning, comparing the metadata of the files in the project directory, not to find evidence for anyone, but because once she had opened the logs, she wanted to know who had touched that directory during the previous 18 months. She sorted the files by creation time, and somewhere among the files in the 20s, she stopped. It was the strategy presentation Preston Galloway had delivered to the board in February of that year, a file bearing his name in both the author field and the field identifying the last person to modify it. But the device listed as having created the file bore a different machine name, and that machine was the workstation in the Harbor Operations Office, device number 114, the computer that, according to the asset register, had been assigned to Sloane Merrick 4 years earlier. The file had been created at 12 minutes past 3 in the morning, 11 days before the board meeting. Constance stared at that line for a long time. She didn't print it immediately. She checked it a second time from a different direction, beginning with the equipment asset register instead of the project directory, and reached exactly the same result. Then she opened the investigation record and added another entry, writing down precisely what she had found, the device number, the timestamp, and the file name, without adding a single word about what it might mean, and without naming anyone beyond the names already present in the metadata. She signed it, stamped it with the date, and placed it in the same cabinet behind her, where she had stored the printed copy of the warning memorandum the week before. She didn't send that entry to the board because it fell outside the scope of the complaint she was required to investigate, and she was a woman who never sent anything beyond the limits of her mandate. She sent only her conclusion regarding the complaint. That conclusion was 9 lines long, and it stated that there was no basis for the allegation that documents had been removed, that the evidence attached to the complaint had been cropped and didn't match the originals in the system, and that the legal department recommended determining who had created those screenshots. The complaint was withdrawn the following morning, after existing for 48 hours, and the person who withdrew it offered no reason at all. Preston Galloway read the conclusion in his office, read all 9 lines, then read the final line once more. He had anticipated Beatrix's reaction, anticipated the board's reaction, and even anticipated what people would whisper in the hallways. What he had never accounted for was the woman of 57 sitting on the 3rd floor, the woman who hadn't raised her voice once in 11 years, the woman who took no one's side, and who, for that very reason, couldn't be bought, threatened, or drawn over to his. He sat alone in his office and understood that the most dangerous person in the building wasn't the one who shouted the loudest in the conference room, but the one who sat quietly and recorded everything exactly as it was. The independent load test began at 9 o'clock on Friday night, 2 days before the scheduled live operation, and Kestrel sent 3 engineers from the inspection firm to stand inside the control room and watch the entire process from beginning to end. $38 million worth of frozen cargo from the first shipment had already been assembled in 4 cold storage warehouses at the harbor, but it hadn't entered the line or undergone transfer. It remained inside the warehouse's fixed refrigeration systems and was still completely safe, because what was being tested that night wasn't the cargo, but the system that would have to carry the weight of that cargo on Monday morning. They ran a simulation using the complete data flow of a peak operating day. For the first 2 hours, everything looked perfect. Preston Galloway stood at the back of the control room with his hands clasped behind him and told the Kestrel representatives that he had said all along that the recent concerns were entirely unfounded. At 11:20, the system was pushed to 80% of its designed capacity, and it remained stable. At 10 minutes to midnight, they raised it to 90%. The first warning appeared at 7 minutes past midnight. And it wasn't a major alarm. It was only a yellow line in transfer bay number 4 indicating that the sensor response delay had exceeded the threshold. One of the engineers asked what it meant. The operator on duty said it happened from time to time. 3 minutes later, a second yellow line appeared in bay number 5. Then another appeared in bay number 6. At 12:21, the first line turned red, and on the main display, an entire row along the outermost edge of the transfer diagram began changing color one after another, like a line of light slowly going dark. This was what was happening. At high load, the system read temperatures in alternating cycles between the bays, and the accumulated delay caused the bays at the end of each cycle to be read approximately 1.5 degrees later than they actually should have been. That figure of 1.5 degrees was the very threshold written into Appendix B, the threshold that someone had proposed raising the week before to match industry standards and make everything simpler. Under the test conditions, the system believed the cargo was still within the safe range when, in reality, it had already been outside that range for 14 minutes. One of the 3 inspection engineers turned to Preston and asked how many tons would now be outside the safe range if this were real cargo. No one answered him. At 12:40, they stopped the test. Not because it had run its full course, but because the head of the inspection team ordered it stopped. He said he had seen everything he needed to see. The 31-year-old shift manager who had signed the box, certifying that the system was ready for commercial operation at 1:40 the other afternoon, stood in the corner of the room, staring at the red screen without being able to say a word. And only much later did he ask the person beside him, where the report he had been told was under review was now. Beatrix Strand received the call at 12:50 and arrived at the company at 1:25. She didn't enter the control room. She went straight upstairs and into the conference room, the same room she hadn't set foot in since that morning, and she switched on a single lamp in the corner instead of turning on all the lights. The file was still lying exactly where it had been left, at the head of the table, its spine facing outward and the edges of its pages still perfectly straight, because no one had touched it during the past 2 weeks. Beatrix pulled out a chair, sat down, and remained motionless for a while before reaching for it. She opened the first page. She had already read that page. She remembered the first 4 lines exactly, and she remembered the irritation she had felt while reading them. The feeling that a subordinate was telling her something couldn't be done. This time, she read the entire first page. Then she turned to the second page, the page she hadn't once turned to 2 weeks earlier. And there, on the 9th line, was a sentence written in the plain language of someone who had no intention of impressing anyone. It stated that at loads above 85%, the delay in the reading cycle would cause the bays at the end of the cycle to report an error of approximately 1.5 degrees, and it recommended that the threshold in Appendix B remain unchanged until the problem had been corrected. The date was written beneath it. Beatrix Strand looked at that date, then looked at the clock on the wall, which read 2 o'clock in the morning, and she sat alone in that room for a very long time without turning another page. On Saturday morning, Wallace Drum drove Massimo Orsini from the Western warehouse back downtown, and they had been on the road for about 10 minutes when Wallace spoke, something he very rarely did. He said he had a question, and apologized in advance if it was a foolish one. Massimo told him to ask. Wallace said that for the past 2 weeks, he had heard people talking in the motor pool. Everyone was talking about the chief executive officer. Everyone was talking about that director of strategy. And everyone was talking about Miss Merrick leaving the company. Then he said there was one question he hadn't heard anyone ask. He asked who had brought that man Galloway into the company. Massimo didn't answer at once. Wallace added that he was only a driver, that he knew nothing about contracts or systems, but that he had driven every kind of person there was over the past 20-some years. And he had noticed one thing. People often looked at the man causing the trouble and forgot to ask who had opened the door and let him walk in. Then he fell silent. He said nothing more, and for the rest of the drive, he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. That afternoon, Massimo arranged to meet Gideon Palmer at the restaurant on Aliciana Street, where the two of them had met once a month for the past 12 years. Gideon arrived 15 minutes early, as he always did, ordered coffee for both of them, as he always did, and began by asking about the previous night's test, with precisely the concerned expression of a man who genuinely regretted what had happened to the company. They talked for nearly 40 minutes. Gideon spoke about the board, the investment fund, and the need for someone to step forward and accept responsibility in order to reassure Kestrel. And he said all of it smoothly and coherently, without a single unnecessary word, just as he had spoken for 12 years. Then Massimo asked how Preston Galloway had come into the company. Gideon lifted his coffee cup and answered at once, saying that Galloway had come through a recruiting firm in Philadelphia early the previous year, that his resume had been excellent, that he had 15 years of experience in the industry, and that Gideon himself had met him once during the final round of interviews. Not one detail of his answer was wrong. He had simply answered a little too quickly, exactly one beat faster than every other answer he had given in the previous 40 minutes, so quickly that the words came before even the brief pause an ordinary person would need to recall something that had happened 18 months earlier. Massimo didn't ask again. He changed the subject and asked about the cargo flow digitization project and how far it had progressed. Gideon said it was an ambitious and expensive project. Massimo said that once it was fully operational, every container entering or leaving the port would carry a timestamp, every routing change would be logged, and every signature would be tied to a person and a clock. Gideon said that was true, and that it would be good for the company. Massimo asked whether he foresaw any difficulties. Gideon smiled and said the only difficulty he saw was the cost. He said nothing more, and he didn't need to, because 12 years in that position had taught him that saying less was safer. But he had also occupied that position long enough to know something he didn't mention across the table that day. The new system wouldn't merely record what passed through the port beginning the next morning. It would also be loaded with the entire archive of data from the previous 10 years for calibration. And when that happened, an old shipping route, one that had been discontinued long ago, would emerge into the light, along with every signature that had ever authorized it. That was the only thing in the world that kept Gideon Palmer awake at night. The two men parted at the restaurant entrance and shook hands, and Gideon said Massimo should call him any time if he needed anything. Massimo said he knew. He went out to the car, sat in silence for a while, then called the head of the independent audit team working inside the company. He didn't say a single word about the conversation he had just had, didn't name anyone in accusation, and didn't explain his reason. He merely said that he wanted to change the search criteria. The other man asked how. Massimo said that instead of filtering by project, he wanted the entire archive searched again by inspection signature, covering all 10 years without excluding a single year. The audit team took 2 days to run the entire archive again using the new search criteria, and the results returned 411 documents bearing Gideon Palmer's inspection signature across a span of 10 years. Most of them were equipment acceptance reports, lifting equipment inspection records, and warehouse safety assessments. the kind of tedious material no one ever read a second time. They arranged them in chronological order and began reviewing them from newest to oldest. And for those 2 days, nothing drew their attention until they crossed the 9-year mark. There, the list suddenly grew unusually dense within the space of a single month, and among the documents from that month was one unlike any of the other 411. It wasn't an acceptance report. It was the final inspection report on the cause of the accident at the warehouse on Pier 12. Constance Brannigan was the one who opened it, because the audit team forwarded it to the legal department the moment they realized it fell outside the scope of their financial review. The document was 6 pages long. On page 4, under the conclusion, there was a single paragraph written in dry administrative language, stating that the cause of the accident had been determined to be the unsafe actions of a worker on the night shift. And at the end of that paragraph was a name, Hoyt Merrick. She read the name and had to set the paper down for a moment. Then she turned to page 5, the appendix, and there she found a list of the 8 people who had been present during the night shift. Beside 4 of the names was a note stating that they had been removed from the area before the eastern section of the roof collapsed. And in the column identifying the person who had taken them out, all 4 lines bore the same name that appeared on page 4. Constance sat for a very long time with the 2 pages open beside each other, the conclusion and the appendix. The same man cast in 2 roles that couldn't possibly coexist. Then she did what she always did. She drew no conclusions. She went looking for more. She asked the audit team to extract everything bearing a timestamp from around that month, and they sent it to her that afternoon. The preliminary site inspection report prepared by the technical team within the first 48 hours contained a line stating that the guidance system in the eastern section needed to be examined, and that line never appeared again in the final report. 11 days separated the 2 documents. During those 11 days, according to the archive log, the final report had been opened and edited 7 times, the last at 10 o'clock at night, and the person who gave the final approval closed the entire file and forwarded it to the city regulatory authority was Gideon Palmer. Constance checked one more thing. She looked up the insurance payment associated with the accident and found that the compensation claim, filed by the family of the man who had been blamed, had been denied on the grounds that the worker had been at fault. She looked at that line of refusal and thought of a 19-year-old woman somewhere in this city 9 years earlier. And she thought about what that woman had done during the 9 years that followed. And she thought about the immaculate filing cabinet with an index on its first page. And she understood why, for 9 years, the name Merrick had never appeared on a single document belonging to this company. She arranged everything in order, numbered every page, prepared a record of receipt, signed her name, then sat motionless in her office for a long while with half the lights turned off. The clock read 11 o'clock at night. She picked up her telephone, found the number she had called once at 10:40 on Monday night 3 weeks earlier, and placed the call. Massimo Orsini answered after the first ring. Constance Brannigan didn't greet him, didn't offer an introduction, and didn't explain what she was holding in her hands. She said only one sentence, that he should come down there. Massimo Orsini arrived at the building at 11:40 that night, and on the way there, he called Sloane and said only that she needed to be there, and she didn't ask why. The 3 of them sat in Constance's office with 6 pages spread across the table between them, and Constance offered no explanation. She merely turned the pages around so they faced the right way, then pushed her chair back. Sloane read page 4 first. She read the concluding paragraph, read the name at the end of it, and said nothing. Then she turned to page 5 and read the night shift roster. 8 people, and the column on the right with 4 lines of notes, and the same name repeated 4 times. She read the entire page, then returned to page 4 and read it once more, then turned back to page 5, and she did that 3 times, slowly, like someone trying to find the error in a calculation she knew couldn't possibly have produced that answer. Constance quietly said that the original preliminary inspection report had contained a line about the guidance system in the eastern section, and that the line had disappeared from the final report after 11 days and 7 revisions. Sloane asked who had signed the final report. Constance pointed to the lower corner of page 6. Sloane stared at the signature for a very long time. She had seen that signature no fewer than 100 times in 9 years, on lifting equipment inspection reports, on acceptance forms, at the bottom of documents she herself had placed into files and stored on shelves. She set the page down and said that this man had sat at the same table and eaten with her at least 4 times. Massimo said nothing. He had finished reading several minutes before she had, and he hadn't moved since. He didn't rise, didn't pace the room, didn't ask Constance another question, and didn't take out his phone. He merely sat there with both hands resting on the tabletop, and Constance later said that in 11 years of work, she had never known a silence that made her feel so cold. That silence lasted nearly 4 minutes. Then Massimo spoke, and his voice remained perfectly calm. He said that 9 years earlier, when his father died and he took control of everything, the first person to walk into the room and tell him not to worry, that he would take care of everything, was the man whose signature appeared in the lower corner of page 6. He said the man truly had taken care of everything, that he had done it very well, and that in 12 years Massimo hadn't once checked anything the man had placed before him to sign. Then he added that the accident at Pier 12 had happened during that very month, and that he had approved the expenses for dealing with its aftermath without reading a single line of the inspection report, because he had been 25 years old then and had been occupied with matters he believed were more important. Sloane said that meant he hadn't known either. He said that not knowing wasn't an excuse, it was only a fact. Then he fell silent again for a while, and Constance quietly began to rise, intending to leave the room, but Massimo told her to remain seated because what he was about to say needed to be heard by a third person. He turned to Sloane and asked her a single question. He asked whether she wanted the man to disappear, or whether she wanted the entire city to know her father's name. He didn't explain what the first choice meant. He didn't need to. She looked at him and understood that he had just placed something on the table that he had never offered anyone in 12 years. And she understood that if she chose it, it would be done cleanly. No one would ask any questions, and she would never hear the name Gideon Palmer spoken again for the rest of her life. Sloane sat in silence for a very long time. Then she said that if he disappeared, the document would still remain unchanged in the city's records. She said that for 9 years, every time she passed that place, every time she signed a contract under another name, every time she heard someone mention the Merrick name in a voice that seemed to turn slightly away, that document had still been there, and it had continued to say the same thing. She said she didn't need a man to disappear. She needed the paragraph on page 4 to be struck out and rewritten correctly, in an official document bearing a seal and a date, so that anyone who opened the file in the years to come would read that her father had gotten 4 people out. Then she said one final thing, that she wanted the entire city to know his name. Massimo nodded once. He said that in that case, it would take longer, it would be harder, and there would be nothing in the process to give her the satisfaction of revenge. She said she didn't need satisfaction. She only needed the truth set right. Gideon Palmer arrived at the records warehouse on Clinton Street at 10:40 the following night, and he came alone, driving himself and unlocking the door with his own access card, because for 12 years he had been authorized to enter any company facility at any hour, and no one had ever asked him why. He knew exactly which row of shelves to find. He pulled out a cart, took down 4 boxes of files from the highest shelf in the 9th row, boxes labeled from 10 years earlier, and he worked quickly and neatly, without opening them to check, because he knew by heart what was inside. He had pushed the cart about 20 steps toward the door, when every ceiling light in the warehouse came on at once. White, even light poured across all 4 rows of shelves, and beneath that light, the cart, with its 4 boxes of files, stood in the middle of the aisle so plainly that no explanation could possibly account for it. Gideon stood still. He didn't turn around at once. He looked toward the rolling door at the end of the aisle, and there stood a man with his arms at his sides, holding nothing, saying nothing, simply occupying the center of the doorway. Gideon recognized him. He had paid the man's wages for 7 years. He tried to offer an explanation, saying that he had only stopped by to retrieve some old records for comparison during the audit, but the man didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't shake his head, and didn't move from where he stood. Gideon looked toward the side door on the eastern wall, and there was another man standing there. He remained that way for nearly half a minute, one hand still resting on the handle of the cart, and during that half-minute, he understood that the lights hadn't come on by themselves, that they had been waiting for him before he ever left his house, and that he wasn't several hours too late. He was several days too late. He released the handle. The door at the far end opened, and the person who entered wasn't Massimo Orsini. Sloane Merrick walked down the center aisle with a folder in her hand, passing the cart as though it weren't there. She placed the folder on the inventory table in the middle of the warehouse, directly in front of him, turned it so it faced the right way, and opened it to the page that had already been marked. It was page 5, the night shift roster. 8 names, and the column on the right with 4 lines of notes bearing the same name repeated 4 times. Gideon looked down at the document, but he didn't read it because he didn't need to. He had been the one who closed that file 9 years earlier. He began to speak. He said she didn't understand the whole story, that the circumstances at the time had been extremely complicated, that there had been pressures someone her age couldn't imagine, and that he had been forced to weigh many things at once. Sloane let him finish. Then she said only one sentence to him. She said that her father had gotten 4 people out, and that he had stayed behind to find the 5th. She said nothing more. She didn't speak of what he had taken from her, didn't mention the 9 years, didn't mention the denied insurance claim, and didn't mention how many contracts she had signed under another name. She closed the folder, picked it up, turned away, and walked out of the room, passing him without looking at him even once. Gideon Palmer remained there in that brightly lit warehouse, with 4 boxes of files resting on the cart in the middle of the aisle, and a man still guarding each of the 2 doors. And he didn't leave that room until nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. At 7:15 the following morning, Constance Brannigan entered the federal building on Lombard Street with the head of the independent audit team, carrying the 6-page final inspection report, the preliminary inspection report containing the line about the guidance system in the eastern section, the archive log documenting 7 revisions over 11 days, the record denying compensation, and the remaining 411 documents bearing the same signature. She submitted everything, signed the transfer record, received an appointment slip in return, then walked back to her office and worked as usual until the end of the day. Kestrel Foods Group convened the final meeting at its headquarters on Wednesday morning, and the invitation contained one line that Beatrix Strand read 3 times, stating that an independent expert appointed by the buyer would be in attendance. She arrived 10 minutes early with a member of the legal department and a chief engineer, and when the conference room door opened, she saw that someone was already seated on the opposite side. Sloane Merrick sat in the second chair from the head of the table, with a slim folder and a pen in front of her, and she looked up at Beatrix only once, nodded in greeting as one might greet anyone entering a conference room, then lowered her eyes and continued reading. Beatrix took her seat and couldn't speak for the first 2 minutes. Kestrel's chief operating officer began by saying that they had no intention of drawing things out, that 370 retail locations were waiting for shipments, and that every decision made that day could be measured in days and in money. He said they had invited Miss Merrick to participate as an independent expert, that they were paying her fee, and that she represented no supplier. Then he turned to Sloane and asked her a single question, whether, in her honest assessment, the system could still be saved. The room fell silent. Beatrix sat straighter and braced herself for what was about to be said, because she knew exactly what the woman across from her held in her hands, and she knew exactly what she had said to her in that conference room 3 weeks earlier. Sloane opened the folder and answered that it could be saved. She said that first, before she said anything else. Then she began her presentation, and she spoke for 14 minutes. She explained that the fault wasn't in the overall architecture, but in the sensor reading cycle at the transfer stage when the load exceeded 85%, that it was a fault that could be corrected without replacing the module, and that the existing hardware was capable of performing as promised if the cycle was recalibrated and an additional layer of verification was added to the final 3 bays. She said the correction would require 7 days, followed by another 3 days to rerun the load test in the presence of the inspection authority. She said that made 10 days. She didn't emphasize the number. She didn't pause after saying it, didn't look toward the head of the table on the opposite side, and didn't add a single word to remind anyone that 3 weeks earlier she had written that exact number on a sheet of paper that no one had read beyond the first paragraph. She said it, then moved on to the next section. Kestrel's attorney asked why she believed this had happened. Sloane said she hadn't been inside the company during the previous 3 weeks, so she wouldn't comment on any decisions made during that time. He asked about the period before that. She said that was when she had still worked there, and whatever she had thought had been written in their internal documents, which belonged to them, not to her. Then she added that if Kestrel wanted to know, it should ask the supplier to produce those documents, because Kestrel had the contractual right to do so. She said it with perfect calm, without the slightest implication. And it was precisely that absence of implication that gave the words more weight than anything else she might have said. Beatrix Strand listened through all 14 minutes. She had sat in hundreds of conference rooms over the course of her life, and she knew very well when someone was trying to retaliate beneath a veneer of professionalism, and she recognized that what she was witnessing wasn't that. The woman seated across from her was doing one thing and one thing only. She was saving the system, and she was doing it as carefully as if she were still drawing a salary from the company. Beatrix watched the way she rested her hands on the folder, the way she waited until each person had finished asking a question before answering, the way she said 10 days, without allowing those 2 words to ring any louder than the rest. And in that moment, Beatrix Strand saw her for the first time. Not as a line on a personnel roster, not as the box in the lower left corner of the organizational chart that Beatrix had reviewed during her first week and folded away after 3 minutes, but as a human being who had sat exactly 4 seats away from her for 5 months, present every single day, and whom she had never once truly seen. Gideon Palmer was indicted 6 weeks later on 3 groups of charges, including falsifying inspection documents and insurance fraud. And what broke him wasn't the day the indictment was read aloud, but the weeks before it, when one door after another closed around him without anyone saying a word. His access card stopped working one Thursday morning, and the technical department told him the system was under review. 2 consulting contracts he had signed with other companies in the Port District were terminated in the same week, both citing clauses that allowed termination without cause. His seat on the board of the Port Trust was left vacant at the next meeting, and no one offered an explanation. By the time he called the people who, for 12 years, had always answered after the first ring, no one answered anymore. Massimo Orsini didn't call him once throughout the entire process, didn't meet with him, and didn't send him a single word. And when someone asked him about it later, he said only that he hadn't taken anything away from Gideon. He had merely stopped lending it to him. Preston Galloway submitted his resignation on the 4th day after the audit findings were presented to the board of directors, and he did so before the board could reach a decision, because the audit had identified 3 things that couldn't be explained away. The strategic presentation bearing his name had been created on someone else's workstation. The results of the second load test hadn't been provided to the person who signed the certification at the time of signing, and the photographs attached to the complaint had been cropped from the originals stored in the system. He left the building on a Friday afternoon, and no one walked him as far as the elevator. Beatrix Strand wasn't fired. The board of directors met for 4 hours and concluded that she hadn't deliberately concealed anything, that she had been systematically supplied with false information, but the board also entered into the record that she had possessed a formal warning from the legal department before granting her approval and had chosen to proceed. The final decision was to establish an oversight subcommittee reporting directly to the board, and for the next 6 months, every decision she made involving operations or major contracts would have to pass through that subcommittee before taking effect. She kept her title, kept her office, kept her seat at the head of the table, and lost the very thing she had used to define herself throughout her entire career. On the afternoon the board announced its decision. Constance Brannigan brought the minutes to her office for her signature, and Beatrix signed them, pushed the paper back across the desk, then asked Constance a question. She asked why Constance hadn't stood up and left with the others that day. Constance said that if she had left, no one would have remained to preserve the records. Beatrix nodded, then asked another question, her voice entirely different from that of the woman she had been 3 weeks earlier. She asked where Constance believed she had gone wrong. Constance stood there holding the folder of minutes and considered the question for a moment before answering, because she wasn't someone who spoke before weighing her words. Then she said that throughout the previous 5 months, every time Miss Strand mentioned Miss Merrick, she had asked the same question, whether she could be replaced. Constance said she had heard that question in at least 4 different meetings, and each time she had remained silent. Then she said one final thing, that Miss Strand had never once asked what would happen if Sloane decided to leave. Constance said nothing more. She picked up the folder of minutes, said good afternoon, and walked out, closing the door behind her in precisely the same way she had closed doors for 11 years. Beatrix Strand remained alone in that room, and she had no answer to the question she had just heard, because it was a question she should have asked herself on the very first day she entered that building. 3 months later, the Baltimore City Regulatory Authority issued a 3-page correction to the record of the Pier 12 warehouse accident, in which the conclusion concerning the cause was rewritten to reflect the original preliminary inspection report, and the name on the final line of the old paragraph was removed. The document wasn't published in the newspapers. There was no public announcement, and Sloane Merrick received it through the mail in an ordinary brown envelope, no different from any other piece of official correspondence. That same month, at the entrance to Pier 12, a small bronze plaque about the size of a sheet of paper was mounted, bearing the names of the 8 people who had been present on the night shift, and on the final line was a brief sentence stating that Hoyt Merrick had gotten 4 people out of the danger zone and had remained behind to find the 5th. There was no dedication ceremony, no one gave a speech, and no reporters came. Sloane went there alone early one morning, stood and read all 8 names, then left for work. Only then did she accept her title. She signed a contract with Orsini Harbor Group during the 2nd week of the month, taking the position of Executive Vice President of Port Operations. And this time, her full name was printed on the internal announcement, on her business cards, and on every contract she signed, because that family name had been cleared, and no one could ever drag it across a negotiating table again and use it as something to bargain with. All 4 people who had pushed back their chairs and risen from the conference table that morning returned to work, every one of them, and Ruth Ann Bowers was the first to receive her invitation. After reading it, she called to make certain that she truly would be working in warehouse coordination, and when it was confirmed, she said only that in 34 years, this was the first time anyone had invited her back with a handwritten letter. Edie was brought home to her old house in Canton at the end of that month, with one nurse staying throughout the day and another on duty at night. And in the house where she had lived for 26 years, she still couldn't remember any more than she had before, but she sat in her old chair beside the window, and she could still sing that entire song without missing a single word. On a Tuesday afternoon, Sloane received an email from an address she had deleted from her contacts long ago. It had no subject line. The body contained only one sentence, saying, "I should have seen you." Sloane read it once, then sat with it for a while, feeling neither anger nor satisfaction, and seeing no need to reply. Then she closed her inbox, picked up her folder, and walked into the room next door, where 7 people were waiting for her to begin the meeting. The following morning, before the sky had fully brightened, Massimo Orsini stood waiting for her at the head of the pier, and he handed her something. It was her old employee identification card, the card he had picked up from the wooden table 3 months earlier and slipped into the breast pocket of his jacket. Sloane took it, looked at the photograph on it, the photograph taken when she was 20 years old, then said she didn't need it anymore. Massimo said he knew. He said he hadn't kept it for 3 months, because he meant to return it to her one day. He had kept it so he would remember the day she set it down. There is one thing this story leaves behind, and it is simple. Patience isn't weakness, but it must never be allowed to become permission for others to trample over you. Loyalty means devotion to the work and to the people, not enduring contempt in exchange for a seat at the table. And a person's worth has never rested in the title printed beneath their name. It rests in everything that would collapse if that person walked out of the room. If today's story touched you, please leave a like and share it with someone you believe deserves to have their true worth recognized. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that each day you can join us in listening to more meaningful stories. How do you feel about Sloane, about the choice she made, and about everything she silently endured for 9 years? Please leave a comment, because we truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with abundant health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.